The train did not slow down the way Nora Whitfield expected it to. It simply stopped. One long hiss of steam, one shudder through the iron frame, and then silence. As if the engine itself had grown tired of the emptiness outside and decided it would go no further. Nora stood at the window for a moment before she moved. She had been sitting for 2 days. 2 days of soot and smoke and the smell of other people's food. 2 days of watching the country change outside the glass. The soft, green hills of Illinois had flattened into something she did not have a name for yet. Just open land, grass and skin, nothing else. A world that went on and on without asking permission, without offering comfort, without giving any sign that a human being had ever mattered to it at all. She picked up Della and held the child against her chest. Della was 4 years old and weighed almost nothing, but she had been sleeping against Nora's shoulder for the last hour, and her small body had gone soft and warm the way children's bodies do when they trust completely. The girl had pale hair the color of winter wheat and gray eyes that were her father's eyes exactly. Edmund Whitfield's eyes. Nora had not been able to look at them directly for 3 months without feeling something close inside her chest, like a door being pulled shut. She gathered the carpet bag with her free hand and walked to the end of the car. The platform at Miller's Crossing was made of rough pine boards that had baked in the August sun until they were pale as bone. There was a grain elevator to the north. A water tower, a single building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Station and Dry Goods" above the door. That was all. That was the whole of Miller's Crossing, Dakota Territory on the 14th of August, 1887. Nora stepped down onto the platform and stopped. The heat hit her first. August heat that had none of the softness of Chicago summers, none of the shade of buildings and trees. This heat came straight down from a sky that was enormous in a way she was not prepared for. She had known the sky was large. She had never understood until this moment that a sky could make a person feel like they were standing at the bottom of something vast and unconcerned. Something that had existed long before human beings arrived and would exist long after the last of them were gone. Della stirred against her shoulder and opened her eyes. The child looked around slowly. No streets, no buildings climbing toward the clouds. No sound of wheels on cobblestone, no voices calling from storefronts, no smell of bread from bakeries or coal smoke from factory stacks. There was only grass moving in a warm wind and the hiss of the train behind them and the enormous quiet of a land that did not seem to know they had arrived. A man was loading grain sacks onto a wagon near the elevator. He did not look up. Nobody was waiting for Nora Whitfield. Nobody knew she had come. She stood on that platform for a long moment, holding her daughter, holding her bag, feeling the heat press down on her from above and the rough boards press up from below. Then she walked inside to the station agent. He was a thin man with the look of someone who had been in the sun too long or too many years. His fingers were stained brown at the tips, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who spent his days delivering news that other people did not want to hear. He looked up when she entered and then looked at her the way men on frontiers look at women from cities. Measuring the soft hands, the clean dress, the shoes that were already wrong for this ground. She asked about the Whitfield claim. He pulled a map from under the counter without being asked, as if this conversation was one he had already had many times before in various forms. He pointed east. 3 miles that way, he said. Follow the wagon ruts until you see a shanty with a broken fence. He studied her for a moment after he said it. You're the widow, he said. It was not a question. Nora nodded once. The agent looked at the child in her arms and then back at the map, and something moved across his face that was not quite pity and not quite warning, but somewhere between them. He told her what she already knew in broad outline, the bones of the situation at least. Edmund Whitfield had filed for the homestead that spring. His plan had been direct and simple, the way men on the frontier like their plans. Claim the land, build the basic shelter, return to Chicago for his wife and daughter, bring them west. 3 weeks after he filed the paperwork, scarlet fever took him. He died before he could send a letter describing the land. He died before he could warn her about the winters. The claim had passed to her by law, and the law had its own requirements. Under the Homestead Act, he said carefully, she would need to live on the land for 6 months before she had full legal rights to transfer or sell it. That was the deal the government offered. That was the condition attached to the land from the beginning. Leave before February, and the claim would revert open again for whoever filed next. He said it the way he said everything plainly and without apology, as a fact she needed to have. Nora already knew most of this. She had read the papers that arrived in Chicago after Edmund's death, had read them sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, while Della slept, had read them with the particular kind of slow, careful attention that a person uses when they are trying to find a way out of something. The 6-month requirement was real, and she had understood it. But there was a more immediate problem standing between her and any decision at all. She reached into her bag and took out the coin purse. She had counted it 3 times on the journey. She counted it again now on the agent's counter while he watched. $9.40. A ticket back to Chicago cost $11. She was short by $1.60. She put the coins back in the purse. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the map on the counter and at the line the agent had drawn with his finger pointing east. 3 miles that way, $1.60. Not a great sum, not the kind of money that changed the world. Men spent more than that on an evening without thinking twice. $1.60 was a bad afternoon, not a tragedy. And yet that small gap, that unremarkable distance between what she had and what she needed had closed around her as completely as any legal document or government requirement could have. She could not leave, even if she had wanted to. The train fare solved the question before the Homestead Act had any chance to weigh in on it. She had written letters before leaving Chicago. She had asked every person she could think to ask. The answers had all been the same kind of sorry. Nobody had an extra $1.60 to spare, or nobody who would give it to a woman heading west to settle land that was not yet legally hers to settle. There is no dramatic way to describe what $1.60 can do to a life. It does not arrive with thunder. It does not announce itself. It simply sits there between a woman and the train platform, between her and the place she came from, between her and everything she understood, and it says nothing at all. It does not need to. She picked up her bag. She picked up Della. She walked out of the station and turned east. The walk took nearly 2 hours. The prairie was flat in a way that had a particular kind of authority to it, the authority of something that had been exactly this way for 10,000 years and intended to remain so. The land did not care about the wagon ruts Nora followed. It did not care about her city shoes that were already rubbing blisters on both heels before the first mile was done. It stretched in every direction without apology, grass moving in the warm wind sky, pressing down above it, the horizon a clean straight line that offered nothing and withheld nothing. Nora had grown up in the foothills of Western Virginia, not far from the Shenandoah Valley where her grandmother had lived, where the mountains folded the landscape into shapes that felt like shelter. Every valley there had felt like something cupped in a larger hand. She had never thought about those hills as comfort until this moment, walking through ground that went all the way to the edge of the world without offering a single thing to break the wind or frame the view. By the final mile, Della was too tired to walk. Nora carried her on her hip, and the child's weight shifted with each step across the uneven ground, and the carpet bag pulled at the opposite shoulder, and the sun still came straight down from directly above. By the time she saw the cabin, she had stopped expecting much. She had been right to stop expecting. It was barely a structure. It was boards nailed together in the rough shape of shelter, covered partly with tar paper that had peeled away in places, lifting at the corners in the afternoon wind. It leaned slightly to one side, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that it had been tired of standing since shortly after it was built. The fence Edmund had described in the one letter she had received before his death, a fence he had called functional with minor repairs needed, had collapsed entirely. It lay on the ground in pieces, the posts fallen, and the wire slack like something that had decided the effort was no longer worth making. Inside was worse. Dirt floor. One window with glass so cloudy it barely let light through. A cook stove with a stovepipe held together at the joints with wire that had already gone orange with rust. Gaps between the wallboards so wide that Nora could slide 2 fingers through them without resistance. She pressed her palm against the wall and felt the August wind moving through from outside as easily as if the wall were not there at all. She stood in the middle of the single room with Della beside her and let herself understand fully what she was looking at. This was where they would live. Della tugged at her dress. "Mama," she said, "I'm hungry." Nora opened the carpet bag and gave the child bread and cheese. She moved slowly around the cabin while Della ate, touching the stovepipe, the places where the tar paper had been tacked to the outside boards and had begun to pull free. She walked outside and circled the structure once. 60 acres of open land in every direction. No well that she could find. No barn. The nearest farmhouse was a shape on the horizon to the west, maybe 2 miles away, maybe three. She stood in the tall grass for a long moment. The sun was still high and the heat still pressed down, and somewhere in the distance, a bird rose from the ground and flew in a long, curving line toward the south and disappeared. The grass moved around her knees in the warm afternoon wind. She could feel the air moving through the same gaps in the cabin wall from where she stood, outside, the wind passing through the boards as freely as it passed through the open land around them. 11 weeks until October, she calculated. Winter on the Dakota prairie did not wait for the calendar. She had been told it could arrive with force by late October. That gave her 11 weeks to do whatever could be done with what she had. What she had was $9.40, a 4-year-old child, a shack that could not stop the summer wind, and no clear idea yet of what to do about any of it. She went back inside and started looking at the walls. 3 days passed before anything changed. She found water in a shallow creek a quarter-mile to the north, following the line of slightly darker grass that marked where moisture ran beneath the surface. She found firewood, or what passed for it, in the small pile stacked against the back wall of the cabin. 11 pieces. She counted them twice. She stacked them again carefully by size, as if the reorganization might somehow add to the number. She spent the first night on the floor with Della wrapped against her, listening to the cabin breathe, with the movement of wind through the gaps in the boards, lying still in the dark, and doing the arithmetic of survival. 11 pieces of wood, 11 weeks until winter, a stovepipe held together with rusted wire. She did not sleep much. On the afternoon of the third day, she heard a horse. She came to the doorway and watched the rider come across the grass from the west. The horse was gray and moved at a slow and deliberate walk, the way animals move when they have been in a country long enough to understand that urgency rarely improves anything. The rider was a large man, older, though the years of weather on his face made precise estimation difficult. He had the look of someone worn down to what was essential. His hands on the reins looked less like flesh than like implements. His face had been shaped by enough seasons of wind and cold that it no longer wasted expression on things that did not directly concern it. He stepped down from the horse and tied the reins to the fallen fence post without looking at her. He walked toward the cabin with the certainty of someone who has already assessed what he is approaching from a sufficient distance and has formed his conclusions. He did not ask permission before he walked inside. Nora followed him. Della was asleep in the corner on a folded blanket, the carpet bag serving as her pillow, her pale hair spread out around her small face. The man's name was Hadley Croft. He said nothing for a long time after he entered. He examined the stovepipe, first touching the lower joint with 2 fingers and feeling the give in it, the rusted wire flexing slightly under the pressure, and then holding but only barely. He looked at the ceiling where the pipe passed through the roof boards, where the gap around the pipe was wide enough for rain to come through in any serious storm. He moved to the wall and pressed his open palm flat against the boards and stood there, feeling the August wind come through from outside and move across his hand, and he kept his eyes on the wall while he felt it. Then he stepped back and looked at Nora. "This isn't a house," he said. His voice was flat and dry as the ground outside, carrying no particular cruelty, but no softness, either, the voice of a man who had learned that unnecessary softness in this country served nobody. "This is a coffin waiting to be nailed shut." Nora felt the words land. She did not argue with them because they were true, and she had known they were true since the first hour. Hadley pointed to the woodpile outside. "You've got half a cord," he said. "A Dakota winter takes 15 cords to survive. 20 if you want to be safe." He nodded at the stovepipe. "That pipe won't last the first real storm. When it comes loose, you'll have no fire. And without fire, you will not last the night." Nora looked at him steadily. "I can repair the pipe," she said. Hadley looked back at her with the expression of a man who has heard that particular kind of confidence before. With what he said. "More wire," she said. A silence sat between them after that, and then Hadley Croft did something she did not expect. He pulled up the single wooden stool that sat beside the stove, and he sat down on it, which meant he intended to stay longer than a man delivering bad news needed to stay. He looked at the dirt floor for a moment, as if sorting through something inside himself, deciding how much of it to bring out into the room. Then he told her a story. 7 years earlier, he said, January of 1881. A storm had come the way the worst ones came without real warning in the deep cold of the new year. His wife Mabel had been in the cabin with their children. Thomas was 8 years old. Clara was 5. He said his daughter's name with a particular flatness, the flatness of a word that has been handled so many times its surface has worn smooth. The wood had run out at midnight. He had been in the barn 150 feet from the cabin door, tending to a sick horse. By the time he crossed back to the cabin, the temperature had dropped below anything his thermometer could measure. The road to town was buried under drifts he could not push through in the dark in that wind. He burned the furniture. He burned the extra door he had been saving for when the front door finally gave out. He burned every piece of wood he could find by feeling the darkness, moving through the cabin with his hands out in front of him, and it was not enough. His daughter Clara asked him 3 times that night why the fire had gone out. He paused after he said that. He looked at the dirt floor again and held the silence for a long moment. He had no answer for her, he said. He still had none. By morning his children were gone, frozen in their mother's arms, Mabel with them in the end. He had survived. He was not sure across the years since that surviving had been the correct outcome. But it was the one he had been given, and he had carried it forward through every winter since, with the particular heaviness of a man who understands precisely what cold is capable of and can never unknow it. He looked at Della sleeping in the corner with her pale hair spread across her face and her small hand open beside her cheek. That child, he said quietly, deserves better than dying in this shack. Then he stood up. He put his hat back on. He walked to the door. Sell the land and go back east before January, he said. Do it before the money runs out completely, before the cold makes the decision for you. He walked outside, untied his horse, and rode west without looking back. Nora stood in the doorway watching him until the gray horse was just a shape against the grass, and then nothing. The land taking him back into itself with the same indifference it applied to everything. She looked at the stovepipe. She looked at the gaps in the wall where the August air moved through as freely as thought. She looked at Della still sleeping on the blanket. One small hand opened the gray eyes moving faintly behind closed lids, the eyes that were Edmund's eyes. $11, she thought. The ticket home cost $11. She went back inside and sat on the dirt floor beside her daughter and watched the light change on the cloudy window glass and said nothing to anyone for a long time. That night she found the letter. She had been working on the east wall since late afternoon, stuffing rags into the widest gaps in the boards to cut the flow of air. The wind had picked up after sunset and moved through the cabin with more intent than it had carried during the day, finding every gap and sliding through with the patience of something that had no particular deadline. She was working methodically, pressing each rag tight and moving to the next when her fingers found the paper. It was wedged deep in a crack between 2 boards, not dropped there by accident, but placed deliberately, folded twice to fit the space. She worked it out carefully. It was a sheet of paper, cream-colored once, now slightly yellowed at the edges, where it had sat through a Dakota summer between planks of weathered wood. She recognized the handwriting before she unfolded it. Edmund. She sat down on the dirt floor right where she was. Della was asleep. The wind pressed against the outside of the boards. The candle she had placed on top of the stove threw a small and uncertain light. Nora opened the paper in that light and read it in the way you read something when you are not entirely certain your own eyes can be trusted, slowly going back over each sentence before moving to the next. He had written it before leaving the claim, before the journey back to Chicago to bring her and Della west, before the fever took him somewhere between the claim and the city, before everything that had followed. He had written it and folded it into the wall as a message for whatever came next, not knowing what would come next, writing in the manner of a man who wanted to leave something useful behind him, even if he could not say with precision what shape useful would need to take. He described the land briefly. The creek to the north, the collapsed shed to the south with boards still worth salvaging, the nearest neighbor to the west, whose name he had not yet learned. He wrote about the woods situation with the plainness of a man who had already measured it against the realities of the climate and knew what the numbers said. He wrote 2 sentences about the winter that she read 3 times each, turning them over carefully until their full meaning had moved all the way through her. The last line was this: "If you are reading this alone, make the space smaller. The cold cannot fill what it cannot find." Nora read it a fourth time. A fifth. She looked up from the paper at the single room around her. Close to 1,000 cubic feet of open air. When January came, air that would be cold all the way through, cold that no stove in a building this poorly sealed could fully argue with. The walls could not be fixed, not really, not without money and lumber and time she did not have enough of. The stove could not be replaced. The wood supply could not be multiplied. But the space could be made smaller. She folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands. The memory came back to her the way memories come when the mind is very quiet and focused on a single problem. Not a flood of recollection, but a specific and precise image, clear as a photograph in good light. Her grandmother's cabin in the Shenandoah Valley. The back bedroom with its smell of pine and dry wood, and something she had never been able to name exactly, but associated always with safety. And in the corner of that bedroom, a wooden structure that was not quite furniture and not quite a room, but something occupying the territory between them. A box made of thick pine boards with a small door on hinges, just large enough for a sleeping person, just tall enough to sit up in. The bed inside it was narrow and the ceiling was close, and as a child, Nora had found it slightly strange and slightly wonderful in the particular way of things that refused to belong entirely to one category. Her grandmother's voice came back alongside the image, clear and dry and certain, the way old women's voices become when they have been proved right enough times that they no longer see any reason to apologize for knowing things. "The room loses heat," the old woman had said. "The box keeps it." Nora sat on the dirt floor with Edmund's letter in her hands, and the candle burning down and the wind working through the boards, and she began to calculate. A box 6 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, 4 feet tall. That was roughly the size her grandmother's had been, the size that had held a grown woman comfortably through Shenandoah Valley winters, without any heat source beyond her own body and a pile of wool blankets. The mathematics were simple, and she worked through them in the near dark. The cabin held roughly 1,000 cubic feet of air. A box of those dimensions would hold roughly 84, less than a tenth. Two warm bodies generating heat in 84 cubic feet would raise the temperature faster than the cold could steal it back through thin wooden walls and crumpled newspaper insulation. She could not heat the cabin. She had understood that since the first day. She did not need to heat the cabin. She only needed to heat the box. The idea frightened her precisely because it was so direct, because it was the kind of solution that had no room in it for error. If she was wrong about the physics of it, if the cold found a path she had not calculated, the box would become in reality what everyone who saw it would surely call it from the beginning. There would be no second chance. Della would not have a second chance. She thought about what Hadley Croft had said. "Without fire, you will not last the night." She thought about his daughter Clara asking 3 times why the fire had gone out. She thought about Edmund folding a letter and pressing it into the wall of a shack on the Dakota prairie because he wanted to leave something useful, and this was all he had left to offer. She sat very still for a long time on the dirt floor. Then she picked up the stub of pencil she kept in the carpet bag and reached for the piece of newspaper they had been using to fill one of the larger wall gaps, and she smoothed it flat on the ground in front of her. She began to draw. 6 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, 4 feet tall, door on hinges fitted close. Newspaper crumpled between the board layers for insulation, the still air trapped in the folds doing the work that the compressed paper itself could not do. Straw mattress on the bottom, every blanket they owned piled on top of it. She drew it in the diminishing candlelight, with the pencil moving slowly, measuring the dimensions in her head, correcting starting sections again. She drew it the way you draw something you need to build, rather than something you are imagining, each line placed with a specific function in mind. Outside, the wind found the cabin and pressed against it, and the boards groaned and flexed against their nails. Inside, by a candle burning down to its final half-inch, Nora Whitfield drew a box. She did not know for certain it would work. She could not know that yet, but she had the physics of it in her head and the memory of her grandmother's voice and Edmund's instructions written on a piece of paper in her hand, and she could not think of a single alternative that offered any better odds. She was 31 years old. She had $9.40 in a coin purse, and a 4-year-old daughter, and a dead husband's letter found in a wall, and 11 weeks before the first hard cold came down from the north. She had a memory of an old woman's voice from a valley on the other side of the mountains, and a pencil and a patch of dirt floor to draw on. She drew until the candle went out. Then she sat in the dark and held the drawing against her chest and listened to the August prairie moving outside in the warm wind, and she thought carefully and systematically about everything she needed to do next, and she did not sleep and she did not cry. And when the sky began to lighten at the edges of the cloudy window, she was already standing. The saw was heavier than she expected. Winifred Croft opened the door before Nora had finished knocking, which meant she had been watching from the window, which meant she had seen Nora and Della coming across the open ground from a distance. This was the kind of country where you saw everything approaching. Nothing arrived without the opportunity for preparation. That was one of the few mercies the openness offered. Winifred was a solid woman with gray hair pulled back without ceremony, and hands that had the same work quality as her husband's, the hands of someone who had not spent a day of the last 30 years indoors by choice when there was outdoor work to do. She looked at Nora on her doorstep with an expression that was careful in measuring, but not unkind, the expression of a woman who had learned to assess strangers quickly because the prairie required it. She looked at Della standing beside Nora with her small hand wrapped around two of her mother's fingers. Nora asked if she could borrow a handsaw. Winifred studied her for a moment, the kind of moment that contains an entire unspoken conversation. "What are you building?" she asked. Nora hesitated for just a beat. "A box bed," she said. Winifred looked at her steadily. Then she went inside without comment and came back with a handsaw that had a worn wooden handle and a blade sharpened recently enough that it still caught the morning light along its teeth. She held it out. Nora took it and thanked her. Winifred looked down at Della for a moment and then back at Nora with something in her expression that was not quite a question and not quite an answer, but sat in the space between them like an acknowledgement of something neither of them had said. "Be careful with the old boards," she said. "They split sideways if you push the blade too fast." Nora walked back across the open land with the saw in one hand and Della's hand in the other, and the morning light coming in flat and long from the east across the grass. The saw was heavier than she had expected, and the handle was shaped for a larger hand than hers, but she adjusted her grip and kept walking. She had found the collapsed shed on the second day after arriving, half a mile south of the cabin, half buried in tall grass that was in the slow process of reclaiming it. The boards were weathered gray and warped in places along the grain, but the wood itself was still solid. She had pressed several pieces between both hands and they held their resistance. Not perfect, good enough for what she needed. The work of getting the boards loose from the frame was the first serious obstacle. Many of them had been nailed when the wood was still green and had dried tight over years of Dakota summers, the fibers bonding around the iron nails in a way that required patient and systematic force to release. Nora worked at each board with the claw end of the small hammer she had found in the cabin, prying slowly, rocking the board back and forth in small increments until she felt the nails begin to give. Some came free clean. Others split along a hidden grain fault, and she had to assess the damage and decide whether the piece was still usable, adjusting her mental plan for which boards would go where in the final construction. She could not afford to waste any if she could help it. Della sat in the grass a few feet away and watched with the focused attention of a child who understands that something serious is in progress and has decided that her contribution is to be present without requiring anything. Occasionally, she stood and dragged a small board through the grass with both hands, pulling it a few feet closer to the growing pile. It was not much assistance in any practical sense. But Nora watched it happening out of the corner of her eye as she worked and felt something in her chest that was not grief and not gratitude, but lived close to both. The sawing began the following morning. She spent the previous evening laying out the boards by size on the dirt floor of the cabin, measuring each piece with a length of twine she had knotted at the right intervals, marking the cut lines with a piece of charcoal from the dead stove. The design she had drawn by candlelight was now translated into a collection of gray weathered boards arranged by purpose. She knew which boards would form the long side walls, which would close the short ends, which would make the floor of the box, and which would serve as the ceiling. She had the measurements held precisely in her head, 6 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, 4 feet high. She had thought through the door placement and the hinge positions until the whole structure was as complete in her mind as if she had already built it. Now she had to build it with her hands instead of her head. The first cut was the hardest because she did not yet know the saw's particular character. Every tool has its own tendencies, and the only way to learn them is through use. The blade wanted to drift left when she did not consciously correct it, and finding the right corrective pressure on the handle required 3 cuts before she understood the angle. By the fourth cut, it was becoming familiar. By the sixth, the motion had settled into the long, steady rhythm of hand sawing the pull and push that becomes almost automatic when you fall properly into it. Things did not always go smoothly. The blisters began before the first hour was done, on the heel of the palm, below the thumb, where the handle pressed hardest. Then across the tops of the fingers. She felt them forming the soft gathering of fluid beneath the skin that preceded the real pain. She stopped and looked at her hands and then continued. There was no option available that made more sense than continuing. The blisters formed, thickened, and then sometime in the second hour they broke, and the raw skin beneath them met the wooden handle directly. She let out one short breath and kept her grip and kept sawing. Della brought her water from the creek twice during the morning, making the quarter-mile trip solemnly with the tin cup held in both hands, walking with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something important. She lost only a small amount of water on each return. Nora drank without stopping work and handed the cup back, and the child turned around and went again. By the evening of the second day, she had all the boards cut to their required lengths. Her hands had moved past the specific acute pain of the blisters into a broader ache that belonged to the work itself, rather than to her personally, the deep fatigue of muscles asked to do something they had not done before. She wrapped her palms in strips torn from the hem of her spare dress, slept on the dirt floor with Della, and was back at the shed site before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The carrying came next, half a mile of open prairie between the shed site and the cabin. She could manage 3 boards on her shoulder at a time, balanced the way she had watched men balance lumber, leaning slightly into the load. She was not a slight woman, and she had grown up in a household in the Virginia foothills, where physical work was ordinary, but 3 boards across half a mile of uneven grass in the August heat found the edge of what she had available and pressed against it. Della walked beside her on each trip, dragging the narrower pieces through the grass with both hands, her small face set with an expression Nora recognized because it was her own expression worn on a smaller face. They made 11 trips the first day, 14 the second. The third day and the fourth, they carried what remained of the usable lumber. By the end of it, enough material was stacked at the cabin to begin the actual construction. The Bosch went up over the following 2 weeks each evening after Della was asleep, and in whatever daylight hours, the other necessary work of keeping them fed and watered and warm enough as September arrived allowed. She had never framed a structure before. She had observed men do it since childhood, had grown up watching her father and uncles work with wood as if the knowledge were in their hands rather than in their heads. But watching from the outside and doing from the inside are separated by a distance that is not apparent until you are standing on the inside of it for the first time. She made mistakes. She nailed 2 of the lower frame boards at an angle that was wrong and had to pull them free and reset them, the wood protesting as the nails came out and the grain around the holes compressed. She misjudged the door frame dimensions twice before the third attempt produced an opening that would accept the door she had built from the salvage boards. The hinge placement required 3 different positions before she found the one that let the door swing cleanly and close flush. But the walls rose. Each board that went into place was another layer between Della and what was coming, and that calculation was simple enough to keep her moving past the point where her hands said to stop, past the point where her back made its own argument, past the point where the September light was too low to see precisely what she was doing. She pasted the newspaper insulation between the board layers the way her grandmother had done it in the Shenandoah Valley, crumpling each page first to create pockets of trapped air within the folds before smoothing it against the inner boards, then nailing the outer boards over it. She used the Chicago Tribune editions she had saved from the months before leaving, the words disappearing between layers of wood where they would do more work as insulation than they could as information now. She paused once over a page with a story about the new Marshall Field's expansion on State Street, a feature about winter fashions, an advertisement for a Michigan Avenue hotel, a world as distant in this moment as something she had read about in a history book. She folded the page and pressed it into the wall. By the third week of September, the box was finished and standing in the corner of the cabin. It looked strange. There was no more precise word for it. A wooden structure the approximate size of a large steamer trunk, but scaled for a person sitting in the corner of the small, single-room cabin, like something from an entirely different category of object. A room that existed inside another room, a crate built to sleep in. The door hung on its hinges and closed with a wooden latch. She had shaped herself from a scrap piece, fitted so it would seat firmly without rattling. Inside the straw mattress, assembled from dry grass, bundled and tied flat. The feather ticking brought compressed in the carpet bag from Chicago. 3 wool blankets, 2 quilts, newspaper packed into every internal wall. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, and it was done, and it was hers. Constance Merrill came one afternoon not long after. She was a woman in her late 50s with a long face and sharp eyes that moved quickly and registered everything, and she had walked 2 miles from her farm to the east, specifically to see what the widow from Chicago was constructing inside her cabin. She had heard about it from someone and had formed opinions before she arrived that were visible in the way she moved through the door. Constance circled the finished box twice without speaking. She opened the door and looked inside. She closed it. She pressed her palm against the outer wall, testing the solidity of it. "What is this?" she said. "A box bed," Nora said. Constance shook her head with the measured slowness of someone who has lived long enough in a hard country to know which ideas survive contact with reality and which ones kill the people who believe in them. "That works in stone houses back east," she said. "Not in a board shack like this one. The cold comes through regardless of what's inside. You're gambling your child's life on a memory." Nora was kneeling at the door, tightening the lower hinge with the flat head of a nail. She did not stop what she was doing. "Then help me make sure I'm not wrong," she said. Constance stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes moving between Nora and the box and Della, who was sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor nearby, arranging small stones in a pattern that had its own internal logic. She did not help. She walked back out into the September afternoon without another word and went home across the flat ground toward the east. 2 days later, she returned. She came in the late afternoon light with a basket containing a dozen eggs and 3 jars of preserves. She set the basket on the stove without explanation or preamble. She looked at the box for one long moment, a look with something different in it than the look from 2 days before, less certainty and more something else she was not yet ready to name. She looked at Della. She walked back out. Nora watched her go. She understood something that she had not fully understood yet about how people on this prairie communicated what they could not quite say directly. Returning with something in your hands when you had left with an argument was its own kind of statement. October arrived with sharper edges than September, which had itself been harder than August. The nights dropped below freezing by mid-month. The first ice appeared on the water bucket left outside each morning, thin and fragile and gone by noon but present. A preliminary notice from the season that was preparing itself. Nora had started sleeping in the box with Della in early October, not because the cold yet required it, but because she needed to understand what she had built. She needed to know how long it took to warm from a standing start. She needed to learn what the box could find in the cold and what it could not. The first nights the air inside was cool when they closed the door, and both of them shivered for 15 or 20 minutes before the change began. 2 bodies in 84 cubic feet, 2 sets of lungs, 2 sources of steady radiant warmth slowly overcoming the cold they had enclosed themselves inside. By 20 minutes the difference was real. By 30 it was clear and unmistakable. Not warm in any way that used the word loosely. Survivable. On the Dakota Prairie in the autumn of 1887, that was the measurement that mattered. November arrived and the question the box was built to answer became actual rather than theoretical. Hadley Croft came on the 3rd day of the month. She heard his horse before she saw him, was inside adjusting the newspaper packing in one of the box wall sections where she had found a gap in the insulation, and when she stepped out, he was sitting on his horse in front of the cabin door, looking at the structure through the open doorway with an expression she could not read from the distance. He dismounted and came inside and stood before the box for a long time. Then he turned to Nora with the same flat and economical expression he had carried the first day. "How many nails?" he said. She looked at him and waited, not sure she had understood the question correctly. He said it again. "How many nails in the outer wall construction?" She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving across the door frame and the hinge placement with an attention that was not curiosity. She recognized the quality of his attention because she had worn it herself by candlelight in August. He was calculating something. He was working through specific numbers in his head while looking at specific joints and angles. He did not explain himself. He said nothing else. He went back outside and rode west toward his own farm, and she stood in the doorway watching him cross the open ground and felt something shift in the situation between them without being able to say yet in which direction it had gone. 4 days later, Winifred appeared at the door in the early evening with a covered pot of bean soup and a small sack of cornmeal, enough of food to matter over the coming weeks if used carefully. She set both items down, looked at Della sitting near the stove, looked at the box with a brief and focused attention, and went home without any of it being discussed. The soup was good. Della ate 2 full bowls and fell asleep before dark with color in her cheeks for the first time in a week. This visit felt different from Constance's return with the eggs and preserves, less tentative, more settled, as if something had been decided somewhere that had not been discussed with Nora directly. The real test came on the 15th of November. The temperature had been dropping since late afternoon, and by midnight had gone below zero, which the thermometer Hadley had left with her the week before confirmed. He had handed it through the door one morning without a word while she was building up the morning fire and ridden away before she could respond, and she had understood it as a gesture that said more about what he was thinking than anything he had chosen to say out loud. She watched the mercury fall through the evening 20 degrees, then 10, then 0, and then past 0 into the territory the instrument registered, but that she found difficult to fully comprehend until the cold itself made its argument in the room around her. The stove worked hard and lost ground. The temperature inside the cabin fell well below 10 degrees by 2 in the morning. Nora estimated the frost creeping across the inside of the window glass and coating the metal of the stove fittings with a fine gray layer that had no business being on the inside of a structure with a fire burning in it. The wind found every gap in the boards with the efficiency of something that had been practicing this for centuries. She and Della had been in the box since 9 that evening. 20 minutes after they closed the door, she felt the shift begin. The slow and gradual accumulation of warmth from 2 bodies in a small space, lungs, processing air and returning it, warmer skin radiating the steady, modest heat that living things generate whether they mean to or not. The air in those 84 cubic feet began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably and then unmistakably, degree by degree, rising away from what pressed against the outside of the wooden walls. She lay on her side with Della against her chest and her arm around the child and listened to the cabin freeze around them. The sound of wood contracting in the cold, the stove ticking as the fire burned lower, the wind working through the outer boards with the ease of something that knew every gap personally. Inside the box, warmth, not comfort, not the warmth of a well-heated room or a good fire. The blunt and particular warmth of 2 bodies that refused to concede to what surrounded them. Della slept through all of it. In the morning, Nora opened the box door and the cabin air hit her like stepping into a different world. The bucket water was frozen solid. The frost on the window glass was thick enough to write in. She stood in the frozen room with her arms wrapped around herself and felt something settle in her that had not been settled since August. Not relief exactly, something quieter than relief. The specific stillness that comes when a thing you have built with your own hands and your own calculations does precisely what you designed it to do, when the math turns out to be real. She was rebuilding the morning fire when she heard Hadley's horse. He came inside without ceremony and went directly to the box. He took a thermometer from his coat pocket, his own instrument that he had brought for this specific purpose, and opened the door of the box and set it inside on the mattress. He waited 2 minutes by the clock on the wall that Nora had found in the cabin when she arrived, still keeping reasonable time. He read the temperature inside the box. Then he turned and read the temperature of the open cabin air. He stood for a moment looking at both numbers. The difference was 24 degrees in favor of the box, in a cabin with a fire that had been burning since 6 that morning. Nora said nothing. She waited and let him stand with the numbers. Hadley Croft stood before the box with the thermometer in his large, weathered hand and the morning light coming pale through the frosted window glass and she watched his face and saw something move across it that was too private and too layered to name accurately from the outside. He was 62 years old, and he had been in this country through enough January nights that cold was not an abstraction to him, but a physical memory stored in his body, a knowledge he had earned in a way he would not have chosen to earn it. He stood before this wooden box built by a woman with borrowed tools and blistered hands, and he looked at 24 degrees of difference. He did not say he had been wrong. Men like Hadley Croft did not generally produce those words in exactly that order. But he stood there long enough and with a quality of silence, specific enough that the silence itself communicated something, and when he finally turned and walked to the door, he stopped there with one hand on the frame. He did not look back. He went outside and mounted his horse and rode west toward his own land. 3 days after that, Winifred arrived again. This time she brought 2 dozen eggs, 4 jars of vegetables she had put up herself at the end of summer, and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She set everything on the stove without speaking. She accepted Nora's thanks with a brief nod. She looked at the box one time, a look that held something in it that the earlier tentative look had not, something that had moved past question into a different territory. Then she walked back out into the November gray. On the prairie, Nora had come to understand people did not always say the things they meant most directly. Sometimes they brought food instead. Sometimes they came back when they had left with an argument. Sometimes they handed you a thermometer through the door without explanation and rode away before you could respond. These were languages she had not known before August and was learning now, one return visit at a time. Constance Merrill did not come back in November. But on an evening in early December, Nora noticed a light moving across the flat land to the east, a lantern carried by someone traveling after dark. The light moved steadily for a time and then stopped and then disappeared in the direction of the Merrill farm. People on the prairie did not carry lanterns after dark without reason. She noted it and said nothing about it, asked no one about it, and let it mean whatever it meant. December settled over the land with the weight of something permanent. The temperature below zero stopped being exceptional and became the regular condition of nights and then of days too. The frost on the window stayed all day, never retreating at noon as it had in November. The grass outside was pale and rigid, the color entirely gone, and the sky sat flat and white for days at a stretch, pressing down on everything beneath it as if reconsidering whether to allow any of it to continue. Every night, Nora and Della climbed into the box. Every night, the small space warmed around them. The cabin might drop to 10 below or lower. Inside the box, the blankets held the heat that their bodies generated. The newspaper walls kept the air from moving. The wooden door held the world at the slight but sufficient remove of 84 cubic feet. It was not comfortable. It was not the life she had imagined when she had been a younger woman with a husband and a house in Chicago and a future that had not yet been rearranged without her consent. But it was the life available to her, and inside the box, it was survivable, which was the only category that mattered this far north in this season. She slept more deeply in December than she had since the summer before Edmund died. People across Turner County had been talking about the box for months. She knew this the way you know things in a country where everyone can see everything approaching from a distance. Some neighbors were convinced she had lost her thinking. Others were curious enough to come and look. A farmer named Dunmore from 3 miles north came one afternoon with his teenage son on some invented errand and stood in the doorway looking at the structure in the corner of her cabin and asked 2 questions about the construction. She answered both. He thanked her without committing himself to any position and went back north. She did not know what would come of it. She did not spend energy trying to predict. The 11th of January arrived warm, which was the wrong word entirely. Warm implied something that could be trusted, something that offered what it appeared to offer. The temperature that morning climbed above 30 degrees for the first time in 3 weeks, and the snow on the ground changed character, the dry powder becoming denser, the surface yielding softly underfoot. Water dripped from the roof edge in a thin, steady line. Della went outside for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The child stood in the yard in her coat and her boots that were already too small, and she looked at the sky and then at the changed snow, and she laughed. The free and total laughter of a 4-year-old who has been inside with the cold for 2 weeks and has just been given back the outside world without warning. She stepped into a deep drift and sank to her knees and laughed at the surprise of it, and then stepped somewhere else and sank again. Nora stood in the doorway and let herself feel what the warm air offered for a moment. let herself exist in it without suspicion, just briefly, because her daughter was laughing in the yard, and the air was above freezing, and there had not been much of either lately. Then she looked northwest. Her grandmother had described this kind of day, the warmth that arrives in January on the front of the worst storms. She had called it the wolf's breath. It comes in warm and still, and it smells almost like spring, the old woman had said, and it means something cold enough to kill is standing just behind it, letting the warmth go first. Nora looked at the northwest horizon for a long moment. Clear. Nothing there but the flat line of land meeting sky. But the sky in that direction was the wrong shade of white, a shade with depth and weight in it that ordinary winter sky did not carry. She went inside and examined the stovepipe. She had been watching the lower joint since October. The temperature cycling between cold and cold again, had worked at the rusted wire with the patient efficiency of a process that did not need to hurry. The wire had given a little each cycle, each freeze and thaw taking some small additional amount of tension out of it, and now the joint could be moved slightly under hand pressure, a fractional rotation that should not have been possible. She had rewired it 3 times since August. The wire she had remaining was thin, and she had used the last of it on the most recent rewiring. She looked at the joint for a long time. Then she went to the creek and carried back 2 full buckets of water, which she positioned beside the stove within arm's reach. She brought the extra blankets from the chest and added them to the box, packing them in until the interior was dense with fabric. She checked the wooden latch on the box door 3 separate times, pressing it, lifting it, pressing it again, confirming that the mechanism seated firmly in all positions. Then she knelt on the dirt floor in front of Della, who had come back inside and was sitting near the stove, with her coat still on her cheeks, red from the outside air, and her pale hair windblown. Nora took both of the child's small hands in her own. She looked at the gray eyes, Edmund's eyes looking back at her from their daughter's face. If Mama says get in the box, she said you get in right away. You don't wait. You don't ask me anything. You go right away. Della looked at her with the complete seriousness of a child who understands that she is receiving an instruction that is not ordinary. Right away, Nora said again. Della nodded once slowly with a gravity that was too old for her face. Nora held her daughter's hands for a moment longer than the instruction required. She looked at her daughter's face and thought about Edmund on a train heading back to Chicago to bring his family west, not knowing what was coming. She thought about the letter folded in the wall. She thought about her grandmother's voice and the smell of pine in a back bedroom in the Shenandoah Valley. Then she stood up and looked at the northwest sky through the cloudy window glass at the wolf's breath, warmth still sitting soft and wrong over the frozen prairie. She waited. The morning of January 12th came in like a lie. The temperature had climbed overnight rather than falling, which was the wrong direction for January, February, and wrong for a prairie that had been locked below zero for 3 consecutive weeks. By 7 in the morning, the air outside was 34 degrees, and the snow in the yard had gone soft again, at the surface yielding underfoot with a wet compression that was almost spring-like and entirely dishonest about what it represented. Nora stood at the door of the cabin and studied the sky for a long time before she did anything else. It was pale in a specific way. Not the flat and static white of a winter sky sitting still above frozen ground, but something with movement underneath it. The way deep water looks different from shallow water, even when the surface appears calm. The clouds to the northwest were low and had an edge to them that was too clean, too defined. She had been watching that direction since 4 in the morning, when she had woken from a light sleep and gone immediately to the window. She went back inside and looked at Della. The child was awake, sitting up on the mattress they had been using on the warmer nights, when the cabin temperature was manageable enough not to require the box. Della looked at her mother's face and read something in it that she did not ask about. She sat still and watched. Nora made the fire and heated water, and they ate the last of the cornmeal porridge with a spoonful of Winifred's apple butter. She kept her eyes on the window while they ate. The glass was still opaque with frost in its lower sections, but clear enough above to see the yard and the sky above the roofline, and at the edge of her sight the flat ground running northwest. At 9:30 she hung the laundry. It was the ordinary thing to do when the temperature climbed above freezing after weeks below it. Wet fabric had been sitting in the corner of the cabin since before Christmas, and the smell of it had become part of the room's atmosphere in a way that needed to be addressed. She hung the shirts and the stockings and the small dress she had washed for Della on the line strung between the two fence posts that still stood. The wet fabric hung motionless in the warm, still air. Della came outside and stood in the yard. She looked at the soft snow and then looked at Nora, and something in the air reached her the same way it had reached her the day before. She walked to the edge of the yard where the drift was deeper and looked back at her mother with a question on her face that had no words. "Go ahead," Nora said. Della stepped into the deep snow and sank to her knees and made a sound of surprise that turned immediately into laughter. The free and uncontained laughter of a child who has been kept inside by cold for 2 weeks and has just been returned to the world without warning. She pulled her boot free of the snow and stepped somewhere new and sank again and laughed again. Nora watched her daughter laugh in the warm, dishonest January air and felt something that had been closed for a long time open briefly in her chest. She watched Della step and sink and laugh, and she thought about the gray eyes that were Edmund's eyes, and about a letter folded in a wall, and about the distance between Chicago and Miller's Crossing, measured not in miles but in the full weight of everything a life can become without asking permission. Then she looked northwest. The line she saw there made her stop breathing for one full second. It was not a cloud. It was too low, too solid, too uniformly dark to be cloud in the ordinary sense of that word. It sat on the horizon like a wall being built from the ground, uprising as she watched rather than drifting, thickening from below, as if the earth itself were generating it. She had seen storm fronts in Virginia, had heard her grandmother describe the worst of them. This was a different scale entirely. It extended from one edge of her vision to the other without any visible end. It moved with the purposeful speed of something that had already covered hundreds of miles and intended to cover many more. This was not a storm approaching. This was the storm. "Della," she said. Her voice came out level. This surprised her somewhat. The child looked up from the snow. Inside, right now, something in the words communicated itself without needing elaboration. Della came out of the drift, fast crossing the yard in her two small boots, and Nora caught her hand at the door, and they went through it together. She latched the door. She looked at the window. The sky to the northwest had changed in the 30 seconds since she had last seen it. The dark wall had risen further. The light in the yard was already different, flatter the wolf's breath, warmth departing as if it had never intended to stay. She crossed to the stove and checked the joint one more time. She could feel through her fingertips the movement in it, the metal rotating fractionally under the pressure of her hand, the remaining wire at the absolute limit of what it could hold. She wrapped 3 additional coils from the last scrap of wire she had, pulling as hard as she could manage with both hands. It would hold or it would not. She could already feel which answer was more probable. She pulled the water buckets within arm's reach of the stove. She checked the box door. Then the sound arrived. It came from the northwest, which had become the direction from which everything was now originating, and it was not wind the way wind was described in any story she had read or heard. It was something more structural than whistling or howling, a deep and sustained roar, as if something of enormous mass were moving across the land, and the land itself were registering the pressure. The cabin felt the sound before Nora could see any change through the window. The boards vibrated. The stovepipe moved slightly on its joints. Della stood in the middle of the room and looked at the window. They had perhaps 45 seconds between the sound and the impact. This was something Nora calculated afterward, working backward from what she could reconstruct. In the moment, it felt like no time at all, like the sound and the thing making the sound were the same event with nothing between them. The wind hit the cabin like a physical mass, not the wind that had been arriving all winter, persistent and cold, and finding its way through every gap with the patience of something that had all the time available. This was different in kind and in degree. It struck the south and west wall simultaneously, and the cabin moved. Not dramatically, an inch perhaps 2, but the structure lifted slightly on its foundation sill and then came back down, and the sound the boards made in their nails changed from the groan of structural fatigue to something with a different question in it, something asking not when they would fail, but whether they would fail, which is a different question entirely. The window went white, not gradually, not board by board. All at once, the glass that had been showing the pale January sky went solid white, as if something had been pressed against it from 3 inches outside, the snow, driven horizontally by a wind moving at a speed she had no frame of reference for, and the world outside the cabin disappeared entirely. No yard, no fence posts, no horizon, no northwest, nothing at all but white pressing against the glass and the sound of the storm pressing through every gap in the boards simultaneously. The temperature inside the cabin began to fall immediately, not the slow drift downward of a night when the stove burned low, a fast and aggressive drop, the cold forcing itself through the wall gaps with the pressure of the wind directly behind it, overwhelming the stove's output within minutes. The fire was still burning. She could see the glow through the stove door and hear the wood catching, but the heat it generated was being taken before it could accumulate anywhere in the room. Then she heard the pipe, distinct from the general noise of the storm, a specific metallic sound with direction and intention in it, a rattle localized to the lower joint that she had been listening for since October without knowing precisely how it would sound when it came. She looked up. The joint was moving visibly, the whole collar rotating slightly, with each sustained gust, the last of the wires she had applied that morning, unwinding one coil at a time with each pressure wave. She watched it for 3 seconds. One gust. Two. The joint separated. The pipe pulled free at the lower connection, and the upper section swung once and then was gone, yanked up through the roof opening by the pressure differential between the storm above and the cabin below, and the hole left behind was a direct, unobstructed passage between the interior of the cabin and the January sky. The wind screamed down through it. Sparks and smoke burst sideways from the top of the stove. A lit ember landed on the floorboards 3 feet from where Della was standing. Nora moved before the decision to move had formed into words. She grabbed the near bucket and threw it onto the stove fire in a single motion. The steam came up fast and the smoke poured sideways, and she turned her face away for a moment and then turned back. The fire was out. Smoke still rose through the open hole above, drawn by the draft, and the cold that had been fighting its way through the wall cracks was now entering freely through the open roof, and the temperature was going to fall to whatever the temperature was outside, which was falling, which was not going to stop falling for a very long time. She turned to Della. The child was already moving. She had not waited to be told. She had been watching her mother's face from the moment the pipe began to rattle, reading the information there, and she had heard the instruction given the evening before and stored it, and now she was already at the box door, already working the latch with both small hands. "Get in," Nora said, "all the way." Della climbed inside. Nora was directly behind her, pulling the door shut as she entered the wooden latch, dropping into its slot and the darkness closing around them. The world outside the box continued without them. She could hear it through the wooden walls, through the newspaper insulation, through the boards she had cut and carried and nailed into place with bleeding hands in the September heat. The storm was not loud in the way a single loud noise is loud. It was a sustained condition, a state of being that the world had entered and had no immediate intention of leaving. It was in the floorboards and in the walls and in the roof boards above the cabin and in the air itself, omnidirectional and absolute. The cabin shuddered around the box the way a ship shudders in heavy weather, and the cold came through the outer walls and through the space of the cabin and pressed against the wooden walls of the box from every direction at once. Inside the box it was dark. Nora lay on her side with Della against her chest, the blankets pulled around them, the quilts on top of the blankets. She felt the cold immediately and precisely the temperature inside the box, lower than it had been when they had climbed in that night in November for the first real test, the brief exposure when the box door had stood open, bleeding its stored warmth into the frozen cabin. They were starting from behind and working forward with nothing but their own bodies as the source of everything. She pulled Della tighter against her. "Mama," Della said. Her voice was close and small in the darkness. "I know," Nora said. The fire went out. "I know." A silence. The storm filling all the space that words briefly vacated. "What do we do?" Della said. "We stay in the box." The child was quiet after that. She pressed closer and said nothing more, and Nora felt the small body against her begin the long and unhurried work of warming the air in 84 cubic feet of dark and cold and wooden walls. 10 minutes. The shivering was the productive kind, the honest kind, the kind the body does when it is genuinely and fully engaged in the work of keeping itself warm, muscles cycling through small, rapid contractions to generate heat from the inside out. She let it happen without fighting it. She kept her arms around Della and breathed slowly and let her body do what it was designed to do. Outside the box, the storm took the world apart systematically. She heard something strike the cabin wall that was not wind, something with mass, a fence post, or a loose board from somewhere in the white. She heard the roof above the cabin make a sound she had not heard a roof make before, a long, low flexing, under accumulated weight, the driven snow piling on the boards, while the wind pressed down instead of only sideways. She heard the stove settle as it cooled, the metal contracting away from itself, tick by tick, until the last tick was the silence of something that had finished. 20 minutes. Della's shivering had slowed. The air inside the blankets was measurably different from the air outside the blankets. This was the thing she had calculated by candlelight in August, the thing she had built with hands that bled in September, the thing she had tested and measured in the cold nights of November. The space was small enough. The insulation was adequate. 2 bodies and 84 cubic feet were sufficient. The cold cannot fill what it cannot find. She lay in the dark and held her daughter and listened to the storm dismantle January outside the walls of the box, and she did not sleep and did not speak. She breathed the slowly warming air of the structure her husband had described in a letter pressed into a wall, and her grandmother had built in a valley on the other side of the mountains, the structure she had built with her own hands from boards she had carried across half a mile of open prairie. Make the space smaller. She had. An hour passed. Another. The storm did not quiet. It established itself as the permanent condition of things and remained there with the absolute commitment of something that had no other obligation in the world. The temperature outside the box fell and kept falling. She could feel the cold through the wooden walls, could feel it pressing against the newspaper she had crumpled and packed between the boards with her own hands in the September heat, and she understood through her skin and her lungs and the ache that had settled behind her eyes that what was on the other side of those walls was not survivable for anything that ran on warmth. 30 minutes after midnight, she heard the sound at the cabin door. She heard it because she had been awake and listening with the particular quality of attention that sharpens when you have been in the dark for many hours with nothing else to do but listen. She knew the sound of the storm completely, by now knew every register of it the way you learn a sound that has been continuous for hours. This was different. This came from a specific direction. It had rhythm. It came in intervals with gaps between the pattern of intention rather than weather. Someone was knocking on the cabin door. It was weak, intermittent. The sound of a hand with very little left in it, knocking not with force but with whatever remained of purpose. Nora lay still and listened to it and understood what it meant without wanting to understand what it meant. She understood what was outside the box, the frozen cabin, the open hole in the roof, the temperature in that room which she estimated at 30 below, or working its way there, the stove cold, now for hours, and the storm having had hours to work through every opening in the structure. Between the box and the cabin door was 15 feet of floor that was solid ice and air that would begin damaging exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The knocking came again. She thought about this moment carefully afterward, many times trying to understand it accurately. Not dramatically, but plainly. She did not experience it as a deliberate moral calculation in the moment itself, did not weigh the options against each other with the deliberateness of someone composing a decision. She was simply there in the dark with her daughter warm against her chest, and there was a sound at the cabin door, and she knew what it meant, and she knew what it required. She unwrapped herself from the blankets, carefully, slowly disturbing Della's warmth as little as possible. The box air hit her arms and face as the blankets fell back. Even inside the box, the air was cold against skin that had been under wool for hours. She put her hand against Della's face, felt the warmth of her daughter's cheek. "Stay here," she said. "Do not open the door, whatever you hear." Della made a sound that said she had understood. Nora lifted the wooden latch and pushed the box door open. The air of the cabin hit her like the side of a mountain. Not the cold she had been managing all winter, the persistent difficulty of a structure insufficiently sealed against a Dakota winter. This was a different kind of cold, entirely the cold that did not negotiate and did not offer any of the small courtesies that cold in manageable quantities provided. This was what January in Dakota Territory became when the stovepipe was gone and the roof was open and the temperature had found its natural level without any fire to contest it. This was what Hadley Croft's cabin had become on the night his daughter Clara asked 3 times why the fire had gone out. Nora crossed the 15 feet to the cabin door in her stocking feet on ice-covered ground, moving as fast as she could manage her breath, creating a fog that moved immediately sideways in the draft from the open roof hole. The latch on the cabin door had frozen solid. She worked it with both hands, the metal burning her palms through the thin sleeves of her dress, working it back and forth until she felt it begin to give. She pulled the door open. The wind and the snow hit her simultaneously, and she had to brace against the door frame with both hands to keep from going backward. She turned her face away from the driving snow and forced herself to look back through the white. A figure, barely standing. Constance Merrill was on the doorstep with snow in her hair and ice built up on her eyelashes, and her face a color that had no name in any normal spectrum of human coloring. Her lips had gone past blue into something that was closer to gray. Her hands hung at her sides, and her right hand was still raised slightly at the wrist from the last time she had knocked, as if the raised position had frozen there after the motion stopped. She looked at Nora. She had nothing left for words. Nora grabbed her by the arm and pulled. She was heavier than she appeared, the way people become heavy when cold has moved all the way through them into the muscle, and Nora pulled her across the threshold and turned and put her shoulder against the door to close it against the wind that was trying to come inside with them. She worked the frozen latch back into its slot with fingers that were already losing sensation. She got Constance moving across the frozen cabin floor toward the box. She had to fold her to get her through the door, the box not having been designed for three people, and particularly not for a third person whose body was not cooperating with voluntary movement. She pushed Constance inside and climbed in behind her and pulled the door closed and dropped the latch. Darkness again. Three of them now in a box size for two. The closeness was its own kind of difficulty and simultaneously its own kind of solution. More bodies, more warmth, more heat in 84 cubic feet than two had generated, and the cold they had brought in when the door opened was already beginning to be displaced by the simple biological fact of three living people occupying a space sized for fewer. Constance was present, but not entirely. She was in the condition that severe cold exposure produces when the body has decided to concentrate what it has left at the center and withdraw from the edges, the hands and feet and face growing still, while the core works harder. Nora had read about this state in a medical pamphlet she had found somewhere in Chicago years ago and had never expected to see it. She positioned Constance between herself and Della and pulled the quilts over all three of them and found Constance's hands inside the fabric. The woman's hands were rigid and cold as iron left outside in January. "You're inside," Nora said quietly. "You're in the box." Constance's breathing was shallow and too fast the wrong pattern, but it was present. It continued. Her chest moved. Della said nothing. She lay against Constance's other side with the steadiness that was not the absence of fear, but was something a person did instead of fear when fear was not useful. Nora recognized this quality because she had been working on developing it herself since August, and she had not yet mastered it as thoroughly as her 4-year-old daughter appeared to have mastered it in the dark of that box in the middle of a Dakota blizzard. The storm continued. Constance's breathing changed over the following hour. It deepened and slowed. The rigidity in her hands changed too, the cold releasing its grip degree by degree as the accumulated warmth of three bodies in a sealed space worked through her tissues. She began to shiver, which was a better sign than not shivering, the body reclaiming its argument. She did not speak. She made small, involuntary sounds, occasionally that were not words. At some point she slept. Nora did not sleep. She lay in the dark with her daughter against her from one side and Constance Merrill against her from the other, and she listened to the storm prosecute the world outside with the full commitment of something that had no other purpose. She thought about Edmund on the train back to Chicago, not knowing about the fever that was already waiting for him somewhere in the distance. She thought about him on that train with the letter already folded in the wall and the plan already made, and the future not yet having become what it would become. She thought about the box bed in the Shenandoah Valley, and her grandmother's voice clear and certain and correct about things she had been correct about for decades before Nora was born. She thought about Hadley Croft standing in front of the box with a thermometer and 24 degrees of difference between what was inside the box and what was outside it. She thought about $1.60, the specific, unremarkable, ordinary sum that had stood between her and the train in August. The number that was not a tragedy and not a great sum, and not anything that announced its own significance when it first presented itself. $1.60. Not enough to change the world under ordinary circumstances. Enough under these specific circumstances to have kept her here through everything that had followed. She thought about what would have happened if she had been somewhere else on this night. Sometime past the deepest part of the night, the storm changed character, not ended. The change was subtler than ending, a shift in the quality of the sound from the pure and total roar of something at full force into something with more texture, more variation, more of the sound of something working through its remaining inventory rather than operating at capacity. She registered the change without trusting it. Trusting it would have to wait for further evidence. The further evidence took 2 more hours to accumulate. Then at some point before the dawn, the silence arrived. It was a physical thing, that silence. Not simply the absence of the storm's sound, but the presence of a specific quality of stillness, the kind that exists when something very large has just moved through a space and the space is taking stock of what remains. Nora lay in it and felt it and did not move. She waited. When the light around the edges of the box door changed from black to the particular gray of very early morning, she unlatched it slowly. The cabin air came through the crack with the precision of something that had been waiting, cold in a way that required no instrument to understand the temperature of a space that had had no fire for 14 hours during the worst blizzard in the memory of everyone who survived to remember it. She pushed the door open and stepped out onto the frozen dirt floor and stood in what remained of the cabin after January 12th. Frost on every surface without exception. The walls, the floor, the dead stove, gray and cold as the exterior ground. The window glass covered in multiple layers of ice crystals that caught the pale beginning light and scattered it in small cold directions. The hole in the roof where the stovepipe had been stood open to a white sky, and a perfect column of cold, clear air descended through it steadily. A shallow crust of driven snow had accumulated on the floor directly beneath the hole. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. Behind her, she heard Della climbing out of the box, and then Constance moving slowly, her hands still stiff at the joints, but moving under her own direction, her face a color that had traveled back from where it had been towards something that belonged to the living. The three of them stood in the frozen cabin in the gray light of the morning after the storm. Constance looked at the box. She stood looking at it for a long time. Her face was doing something that it was not accustomed to doing and was not entirely under her control. The specific kind of complicated expression that appears on the face of someone who has been wrong about something in a way that mattered completely and is standing in the physical evidence of it. She looked at the wooden walls, the newspaper visible at the board edges, the door on its hinges, the latch shaped from a scrap piece by hand. She said nothing. The three of them stood in the frozen room in a silence that held everything that could have been said and had no need to say any of it. 2 days passed. Nora kept the box closed during the daytime to preserve the residual warmth in the wood. She burned the spare door she had been saving. She burned 2 sections of interior boarding she judged structurally least necessary. She kept herself and Della and Constance, who was not yet fit to walk 2 miles across post-blizzard terrain, warm enough to survive the days in the frozen cabin by maintaining constant movement through the light hours and returning to the box each night, the three of them fitting by necessity in a way that generated enough warmth to matter. On the second afternoon, she heard horses, 2 of them from the sound coming from the west. She opened the cabin door and looked out at the world the storm had made. Everything was altered. The fence posts were buried to their tops. The prairie had been sculpted into drifts and hollows that made familiar distances wrong. The sky was clear and blue with the particular brightness of air that has been scoured clean, a brightness that had nothing warm in it. Hadley Croft was coming across the snow with his neighbor's son, beside him both mounted, and Hadley had a long-handled shovel laid across the front of his saddle. He had been shoveling out after storms for 30 years. He knew what January blizzards left behind. He knew what 14 hours of open-roof cold with no fire did to the interior of a cabin on the Dakota prairie. He had brought the shovel because he expected to need it before he needed anything else. He stopped his horse in front of the cabin. He looked at the door standing open. He looked at Nora standing in it. He sat on his horse for a full moment in the bright, cold silence of the morning after. Then he dismounted and walked toward her through the snow, his breath coming out in steady clouds, and he stepped inside and stood in the frozen cabin and looked at everything the storm had done to it. The frost on the walls, the open hole in the roof, the dead stove, the temperature that was whatever the temperature was outside because the two spaces had become effectively the same space sometime in the first few hours after the pipe left. He looked at the box. He walked toward it slowly and put his palm flat against the outer wall. He stood with his hand on the wood that was several degrees above the ambient temperature of the frozen cabin surrounding it, the residual warmth of three bodies held in the material, the way heat holds in things that have been taught through construction to hold it. He stood there for a long time. Nora watched him. She had learned his silences over the months, had come to understand the different kinds, the ones that were withholding information, and the ones that were processing it, and the ones that were something else she did not have a precise word for. This was the last kind. When he finally turned to look at her, she saw what was on his face and looked away briefly because it was too private a thing to look at directly without his permission. The face of a man who has just encountered something that has rearranged something inside him that had been fixed for a long time. He said, "I need to tell you something I have never told anyone." She looked back at him. He looked at the box. He looked at the corner where it stood on the frozen floor. He spoke quietly and with some difficulty, the voice of a man attempting to lift something very heavy for the first time and finding with surprise that he is capable of lifting it. "The winter of 1881, he said, the night of the storm, before it came. That afternoon I had started building something in the corner of the cabin." He paused, something like this. Nora did not move. "I had the framing up," he said. "3 walls. Mabel called me in for supper, and I left the tools where they were and came inside. That was when the storm came. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of testimony." He looked at the box. He looked at the door and its hinges, and the latch she had shaped by hand from a scrap of salvaged board. "Thomas was 8, he said. Clara was 5. He stopped again. He was not a man practiced at this particular kind of effort, at taking something that had been sealed inside him for 7 years and bringing it out into the air where it could be examined by another person. He was not practiced at it, and the difficulty showed plainly, and he did not look away from it or disguise it. "My children could have lived," he said, "if I had finished the walls." Nora stood very still. The pale morning light came through the frosted window glass and through the open hole in the roof and fell across the frozen floor and across the box in the corner and across the face of a 62-year-old man who had been carrying a specific weight for 7 years and was setting it down in front of another person for the first time. He looked at her. He looked at Della, who had come out of the box at some point during this and was standing at the edge of the room with her pale hair and her gray eyes and her 4-year-old's complete understanding that something serious was present and that serious things required silence and presence and nothing more. Then Hadley Croft nodded. Once, slowly. The way men on the Dakota Prairie communicated the things they could not produce as words, the way distance between people in that country was sometimes crossed not through sound, but through the plain acknowledgement that something real and irreversible had passed between them. Nora nodded back. The news moved across Turner County, the way all news moved in that country on horseback, and in words spoken at doorways and carried from one farm to the next, with the efficiency of a system that had been built by necessity. On the night of January 12th, 235 people died on the Dakota Prairie. Men caught between their barns and their cabin doors with no warning and no shelter. Families in their cabins when the fuel ran out and the temperature made the decision it had always been prepared to make without consulting anyone's preferences or plans. Families who had not built what Nora Whitfield had built. By the following week, people were coming to see the box. Families from miles away, people she had never met, standing in the frozen cabin and examining the structure in the corner, with the flat and practical eyes of people assessing whether a thing might keep them alive. She showed them how it was built. 6 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, 4 feet tall. Newspaper between the board layers crumpled, first to trap air in the folds. Door on hinges fitted close, seated firmly. Everything she had worked out by candlelight and tested in the cold November nights and verified on the morning of January 14th when she walked out of it alive. She showed them without embellishment. She did not tell them it was certain. She told them what she had built and what it had done and let them draw their own conclusions from the numbers. Constance Merrill told the story herself in the plain manner the prairie required of stories that mattered. She had been out in the storm. Her own box had not been finished, had lacked the final wall, and she had tried to make it home and failed, and knocked on Nora's door with nothing left. She said what Nora had done. She said it once and again when asked each time in the same words the account of a woman who had been on the wrong side of the box door and been pulled to the right side by someone she had publicly doubted. By the following winter, Hadley Croft said there would be boxes in a dozen cabins across Turner County. He had already built his own. Winifred mentioned it the way she mentioned most significant things without emphasis, as a fact she was conveying rather than a point she was making. Hadley had built one in the corner of their cabin in late January. He had built it the way a man builds something he has been thinking about for a very long time, with care given to every joint and every measurement, nothing hurried. He had measured it 4 times before he cut a single board. It was 6 feet long, Winifred said, 3.5 feet wide, 4 feet tall. Nora said nothing. She looked out the window of the Croft farmhouse at the January prairie, white and quiet, now the sky above it clear and ordinary, offering no threat in this specific moment. The land stretched to the horizon in every direction with the same indifference it had always carried, the same vast unconcern for the small creatures moving across it and the small shelters they built against it. $1.60. She thought about that number sometimes in the months that followed, not with bitterness and not with gratitude exactly, but with the specific attention you give to things that change the shape of your life without making any announcement about what they were doing. The gap between what she had and what she needed, sitting there on the agent's counter in August, while she counted and recounted $9.40. $1.60, separating her from the train and the city and the life she had been trying to recover access to. She had not wanted this land. She had not wanted this winter, this cabin, this box she had built with bleeding hands from boards she had salvaged from a collapsed shed. She had not wanted any of it. She had wanted to go home. But she had been here. She had stayed because $1.60 kept her here, and then she had stayed because staying had become a drawing on newspaper by candlelight, in a box built with borrowed tools, in the memory of a woman who had known something true about small spaces and warmth, and a letter found in a wall from a man who had known something too and had written it down in case it was needed. On the morning of January 12, 1888, she had been 31 years old and alone with a 4-year-old child and $9.40 in a cabin that could not stop the summer wind. On the morning of January 14th, she walked out of a box with her daughter alive beside her and a woman she had pulled from a doorstep breathing on her other side, and the clean, cold air of a stopped storm moving through the open hole in the roof and through the cabin and through her lungs with the particular quality of air that comes after catastrophe, air that has been rearranged by what passed through it. She had not built the box because she was brave. She was not certain she was brave at all in any meaningful definition of the word. She had built it because she was cold, and her daughter was cold, and the walls could not be fixed, and the wood would not last, and she had a piece of newspaper and a pencil stub and a grandmother's voice in her memory and a letter from a dead man telling her to make the space smaller. That was all it had ever been. That in Edmund's letter pressed into the wall, that in her own hands. The prairie was still here. She was still here. The spring would come when it chose to come, the way everything on this land came and went on its own timeline without consulting her. There would be more winters. She understood this now differently than she had understood it in August, understood it as a specific and manageable fact, rather than an abstract dread, understood it with the particular confidence of someone who has already survived the worst version of the thing they were afraid of and knows now precisely what it requires. She had built the box. She knew how it worked. She knew what it could hold. Della was outside in the yard. Nora could see her through the window glass, clear now, the ice gone from it. The pale-haired girl with her father's gray eyes standing in the late January snow and looking up at the sky above the endless open prairie with the unhurried attention of a child who has decided that the sky is interesting and intends to look at it for as long as looking at it takes. She was not thinking about the storm that had passed, or the box that had held them, or the 14 hours of dark and cold on the other side of the wooden walls. She was 4 years old and she was looking at the sky, and that was enough. Nora watched her daughter look at the sky. The prairie ran in every direction to every horizon without a single interruption, and the sky above it was enormous and indifferent and cold, and had been here before any of them, and would be here when all of them were long gone, and it did not know their names and did not care about what had happened here and would not remember any of it. It did not care. But Nora Whitfield was still here, and the box was in the corner, and when winter came again, she would be ready.